Wow, that was very good. All I had to do was tap the mic and everybody knew what that meant. As I said, I'm going to conclude today with an attempt to describe the last part of our talks as a triptych following Nassos' word. In a moment, we're going to hear from Carla Antonaccio, more on her in a second. Following her talk, we're going to invite all of our speakers up onto the stage for Q&A for anybody who didn't get their question in, or for any questions that you now realize should really reach across talks. And from there, we will smoothly walk out of here, and anybody who wants to will be invited into the galleries to continue the conversations, the discussions in front of the objects themselves. And then we'll call it a day. It's been a good one. It's been a heavy one, so I think some people might need a drink by that time. And to that point, when Paul, Sarah, and I began talking about this project, I got a little nervous. We were talking about some complex topics that can lead to heated arguments even among the best of friends. A few weeks later, I sat in New Orleans at the AIA meetings and asked Carla Antonaccio for her advice. As one of the foremost scholars in the field, having written some of the ethical codes related to archaeology, cultural heritage, and museums for major institutions, having both excavated and written on ancient art extensively, and being the vice president for research and academic affairs of the AIA, among many other things, I was sure she'd have good advice for us. If I remember correctly, your advice is that we should do this, and that it was going to be very complicated. I also learned during that conversation that Carla had embarked on a similar project at Duke, along with her colleague Sheila Dillon, and I endeavored from that moment to include her in this conference. Since then, Carla has been a steadfast supporter of our project, and we have been in regular communication about her area of specialization and about the collection. Her area of specialization being, of course, objects related to cult, trade, and colonization, and to ethnicity and cultural identity in the Iron Age Greek world. Today, she's going to bring all that together for us, and we'll speak on all that glitters collecting the Iron Age. Carla, thank you.
Okay, that's no pressure, right? And very tough acts to follow in some ways, but you all have set the stage very well for what I want to say, and this also gives me the chance to thank the organizers, everybody at the Menil that I was in contact with, who were incredibly helpful, including the last of the last-minute requests, which included getting into the library yesterday to see a catalog that didn't exist anywhere that I could get to it in the last week or so. So thank you very much for your incredible collegiality and hospitality. Also want to thank various colleagues in this room, especially Sue and Nassos, with whom I communicated ahead of time as part of the discussions that surround this event, because we all share certain expertise, and we're all working in the same field of Greek Iron Age studies. And what are you doing? Because I don't want to overlap or end up being upstage, God forbid. There are some overlaps anyway, which I hope you will all take as a sign of great minds not only thinking alike but thinking in tandem. So with that as my kind of intro, I also want to say just something by way of my own attitude towards museums. I think it would be completely true to say that I would not be an archaeologist if it weren't for the great museums that I was exposed to when I was quite young. I grew up near New York City, and I was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art every chance I got. In the days when you could walk through the Greek and Roman galleries, all those pots in particular, and not really see anybody in there. It wasn't the kind of extravaganza of world tourism that it is now. That was before the really big blockbuster shows, and it was free. That was the other thing. It was free. So I really kind of, cut my teeth on those sorts of collections and sought them out everywhere I ever went. I always had an affinity for objects. And I'm going to quote Dominique de Menil, the same quote I think that Nassos used, but I want to turn it around. She said that she was a frustrated archaeologist, and I actually think that archaeologists are frustrated collectors. And part of why we do what we do is we get to immerse ourselves in this world of objects, their materiality, their charisma, their being in the world without having all the issues around owning them. We get to be the white hats. And so, here I am, an archaeologist through museums, and very grateful to such opportunities when I was a young person. So my focus today is on these small Greek bronzes that we've already heard about twice now that are in the Menil collection. And despite the presence of two other Iron Age specialists, both of whom are actually more expert in this particular body of material than I am, I chose them for a number of reasons instead of, say, some of the ceramic objects that I might have focused on that were, something I could have talked about too. And one of them is that, one of the reasons is that we at Duke received a gift in 2000, well, it came to us in 2005, and it was accepted and entered the collections in 2006, which is about the time I became a permanent member of the faculty at Duke. And it included a number of objects that were strikingly similar, Iron Age objects, including some small bronzes. And I was struck by this. I was intrigued that such objects were of interest to private collectors in the 1960s and 70s, and that they had also been, the group that we have at Duke, several of them had been attributed to Thessaly on stylistic grounds, as far as I can tell. And in addition, since there was very little documentation with these objects when they came to Duke, just recently I've taught a seminar in which some students focused on the collection at the NASHER Museum of Art at Duke. And they had tried to construct, they'd grappled with these questions that we've been hearing about of not only provenance and provenience, but just tried to reconstruct some kind of context, broader context for these objects, which are kind of orphaned. And so that had included, in the case of a couple of the students, by examining trends and collecting, and to look at the fine spots of similar artifacts and try to fit the Duke objects into some kind of narrative, even if not being able to prove anything in particular about where they'd been excavated. And as I said, after Nassos and Sue and I had all communicated about the approaches that we would take in our papers, I decided to focus more narrowly, not to talk again about horses, for example, but to talk about the pins and the pendants that are in the collection here, because I was struck by their number and also how many of them featured bird imagery. This is something that occurred to me. And actually, I don't know how to advance the slides. Which, is it this one? This button? Right button? Okay.
Right button. Yep.
It doesn't. Okay, so I'm just going to show you some of the objects at the Menil. I wanted to ask the question, what is the status of such objects as collectible, by people who have ultimately created collections that are public? So that does not include some of the people that we've heard about today. And I also wanted to ask about, why, when some of the most prestigious ancient objects are larger, later in date, and in other materials like stone or clay, why these small objects, aside from, of course, maybe their modest price, at least at some point in the past. I think it has to do with a lot with personal resonance with these objects in all cases. And as Sue has already discussed, the impact of esteem, which comes out of that article that she mentioned, Chippendale and Gill, esteem for objects of a particular kind on collecting. This is very well known about prehistoric Aegean sculpture, and the Menil has quite a nice collection of that material as well, the Cycladic art that you can see in the gallery. Sue mentioned this, and it's no surprise, considering just the Mediterranean antiquities in the Menil collection, to find Cycladic marble figurines in the holdings, and they're also in the Duke gift as well. There's the first time we have early Bronze Age objects at Duke from the Aegean, and some of them are Cycladic that came in through this gift of 10 years or so ago. So it occurred to me to wonder, were the Iron Age and early archaic small bronzes kind of an extension of this esteem for second millennium abstract representations? And Sue got at this a little bit by showing the Picabia drawing after the Karditsa warrior, right? So this is something, that seems to me to be a kind of parallel phenomenon. And we've been informally talking today, in between our papers, about whether Iron Age objects, had the same impact in the early 20th century that, say, the abstract cycladic figurines do, the ones that seem so incredibly modern to our sensibilities. And I think the answer is yes, but in a different way, perhaps. So, all of this is something that Sue and Nasas have already addressed, these questions of esteem and the meaning of these objects in antiquity, and so I'm not going to say too much more about that aspect, but I'll be brief and make just a few comments. As you heard already, very often the study of such objects as these small bronzes has revolved around questions about whether the images tell or refer to a specific story, especially a myth, if they represent a particular divinity or an aspect of a divinity, or are they somehow generic? Is a bird just a bird? Or is it, does it represent an epiphany of a particular divinity, something that's been suggested, and I'll come back to that. How to understand their imagery within their often lost ancient context, how to understand and to reconstruct their distribution in antiquity, and how to account for widely shared traits that seem to have a kind of chronological distribution, while acknowledging and accounting for the regional variations, what we've been talking about as style, that they seem to manifest. How do objects like the bronze horses, discussed by Nassos, the birds that I'll talk about, other animals, figures of warriors and women, which Sue has worked on, how do they really derive their meaning? And as Sue has so eloquently demonstrated, context is the key, right? And so has Nassos, where do these things come from? What particular find spot do they have? But most of the objects at Duke and here do not have the context that we archaeologists at least could wish for. And, as we've heard, starting even with Brian's keynote, in addition, such objects, and probably their makers, also circulated widely in their own time among communities and sanctuaries. So it is the case that even if we could prove that one or the other of these objects came from a particular sanctuary in Thessaly, it would not necessarily tell us that that's where it was produced, right? And I think Sue really got at these questions about not knowing where entire types might have come from. It's very clear that some things, are more associated with northern regions and end up in sanctuaries, all over the Mediterranean and all over what we now call Greece, right? So this whole problem of origin and of archaeological context is really complicated, even for archaeologists. So the lack of context challenges, and we could say even hamstrings us. We kind of tend to throw up our hands in understanding and recontextualizing objects such as those we were talking about today. So this is a kind of triptych. I didn't steal that from Nassos. I was already thinking that way, but I want to acknowledge that's a very nice metaphor. So I'm going to talk about the objects. I want to talk a little bit about new approaches or creative approaches engaging these objects that are, one of which is scientific, and others are just how do we kind of bring them into the present and make use of them in the present. And that means, I think, for archaeologists, and I'm trained as an archaeologist, kind of stretching our horizons as well. And I want to say up front, before I embark on further discussion, that I had a real squeamishness about unprovenance collections. I still do. I have to adhere to the codes of conduct of my professional organization. But by the same token, engaging with this particular collection, as well as with the Duke collection, one thing I came to appreciate is that object biographies don't stop when they hit museums, right? They're still creating their stories, and the Menils created stories about them, and we are creating stories about them. They exist in our time and place, and I think we need to kind of expand our horizons to deal with that, and it helps us, I think, to pass on, the engagement with these objects not only to the public, but to the next generation of scholars who are our students. So I just want to say that I've had to stretch my boundaries, and I'm glad I did. And you'll find out very quickly how much I'm not an expert in certain areas. But anyway, you'll find I'm going to talk about the particular dealer who brought these objects to Houston through the Menils, and whom I found to be a totally fascinating figure. This is Alexander EOLAS, whom you already heard a little bit about. So that's kind of my roadmap. These Iron Age objects, these geometric objects, such as these two birds here, as you've already heard, were acquired as a group of just over 30 objects, and in 1962 altogether. And 16 of these objects, about half of them, represent birds. And what is remarkable about that to me is that there are various types of ornaments or objects that represent birds in this collection. Some of them are freestanding, like these, on these little bases, these four-pronged or four-star bases, as you see here. They also are supported on different sorts of bases. They're perched on the sort of open basketwork kind of idea on the left, and then on a wheel. And there are other kinds of animals that are on wheels, horses sometimes, and other finials on top of wheels. This may represent a chariot or may not. There are pins. Whoops, sorry. Where's my pins? I guess I have a slide out of order. Sorry, I'll just go to this, just to make the point that because of the grave on the left, this is this grave that Sue also showed. It's on display in the National Museum in Athens, from AMPHIKLEIA in Attica. So it's not just Boeotia. At least it's in the region that we now call Attica, which shows how these objects could be deployed in a context other than a sanctuary, although a grave is also a ritual context. But you can see that these large wheel-like objects are also ornaments, and then you have these composite objects like bird plus wheel. So the objects can get rather complicated. And on the right is a display of material from this ENODIA sanctuary in Thessaly, which includes birds on wheels. Many of these are also found in the Menil collection, and then some other examples of what is considered to be sort of typical sanctuary dedications of this period, and in Thessaly in particular, but not exclusively, and that is very elaborate and sometimes quite large pins, brooches, right? These are large safety pin type things called fibulae, right? So I'll talk a little bit about those, although I'm not going to deal with them in detail. Excuse me. Back to the collection at the Menil, I hope, yeah. And I wanted to just say about fibulae, while I had that other slide up, one really nice example of this large catch plate fibula class was in the NASHER gift, along with some others that I'm not showing you. And I discovered in doing the research for this talk that there's also an example in the Getty that was discussed by Kilian Durlmeyer, whom you've heard about in connection with NASA's talk, who has done a tremendous amount of work on these kinds of small bronzes. I mean, just an unbelievable number of catalogs and studies of several classes of object, especially pins, but not only, also these little pendant figures. She wrote an article that was published in the Getty Museum Journal in, I think, 1978, that included one of these fibulae, catch plate fibulae, a bird that was quite similar, and she cited actually the Menil collection example, which I'll show you in a moment, and another small figure. So, you know, these things are in wide circulation, and they're in many kinds of collections and acquired, by many different kinds of collectors. So I want to just say about the provenance, just to start that discussion about where they were produced or came from. As you've already heard, the provenance of the entire group here is said to be, and these are two more examples from Duke that came with this 2006 collection of these small bronzes that can be easily classified according to the work of Kilian Durlmeyer and other earlier scholars, and again, could be typical of sanctuary material, but not exclusively. Okay, so now we're into the material I really want to talk about. So back to what the said to be from, right, provenance that we've heard about. So as you've already heard in the Hoffman in the catalog for the 10 Centuries That Shaped the West exhibit, in which these objects were published, and which Nassos has already referred to, Herbert Hoffman says, and I quote again, the group of, he says, 29 geometric bronzes published in this catalog is said to come from Thessaly, and there is every indication that this provenance can be trusted. But he says, he goes on to say, although the possibility of some items having been added to the original lot cannot be excluded. Stylistically similar bronzes, he says, have been uncovered in recent years at various localities in Thessaly, including the important sanctuaries at Ferai and Philia, Karditsa, which we've already heard about. And so the sanctuary dedicated to ENODIA is one of these. And Killian Drolmar we've already talked about, so I won't go on from there, but I will just say that as far as the use, the original function of some of these objects, we've seen that they can be in graves, but she suggested that they were originally designed to be hung from trees. And there are some sanctuaries in which votives are hung up on walls or on trees. They're pierced for suspension. They can be clay plaques. They can be made of other materials, wood, for example, but we don't have any direct evidence of this being the case, as far as I know, for the small bronzes, but that's possibly how they were originally intended to be dedicated in a sanctuary. But we don't know for sure, and we don't know whether these were, for example, not found in graves. It seems entirely likely that these kinds of votive offerings or small bronzes had multiple possible depositions and could be offered in a variety of cults as well. And that's something that comes out of my own early work on cult practice, that I was really disappointed to have to grapple with the fact that you couldn't necessarily deduce what divinity was being honored by the offerings alone. You'd have female votive types in male sanctuaries, and you have to admit the possibility that men were dedicating so-called female objects, that jewelry didn't necessarily denote a gendered identity of the votary, and so on and so forth. So that's another complicating factor here. Again, context is important, but doesn't always help us with everything. So as we've already also heard, the Thessalian sanctuaries mentioned by Hoffman have been seriously compromised by looting. And many of the items in the comprehensive typological studies of Killian and Killian Dirlmeyer have uncertain or unknown provenances. And it's also clear, as I've been saying, that the stylistic and typological analyses don't help us with context as much as we would like. And so here are some examples. Again, the Getty on the left, this is published by Killian Dirlmeyer, making a specific comparison with the Menil on the right. And I've already shown you a couple of objects from Duke, which can't be sourced either. So, in terms of context, there are, I think, a couple of possible ways forward. One is the kind of just, shoe leather compilation of all data that we've seen on display today. I thought that the paper on the Egyptian lintel was sort of exemplary for ferreting out from all kinds of sources what could be discerned, what could be discovered, using more traditional methods about the origin of an object and its biography, in the past and in the present, but we often don't have the kind of records that make that possible. And we've already discussed the possibility of creating a kind of database of data on looted sites, and that this could include, I think, the dates of their despoiling, and then that could perhaps be coordinated, I think, with the records of sales and purchases. When you see floods of objects entering the market, as we've seen in the past with things like Apulian vases from southern Italy, that is clearly the result of demand, which accelerates the destruction of sites, and you can see the results in the market. And that might be one way of trying to coordinate a little bit the information from different sources, as we've already discussed. My impression is that from my work with both the Duke collection and the Menil collection is that the Menil has better records than the ones that came with the gift to Duke, and I should just say about that the Duke collection was collected over a long period of time by a kind of consortium of people who collaborated on making choices, and it was never intended to be to benefit the public, at least I think at the time of its formation, and it was not intended to be a teaching collection, although that's what it's now part of. So it was a very different kind of philosophy, and that's become quite clear to me in working on this collection and hearing what people have said about this collection. Especially with small portable objects, maybe not very highly regarded in the earlier years of archaeological excavation, as Sue has so eloquently described. Some of the methods, and as we've now heard from Jen, these methods are not going to get us all the information that we might hope for. So what we lose when we lose archaeological context is being able to recover the dense networks of exchange, stylistic influence, production, and meaning that these artifacts could reveal. I think according to traditional methods, that's true. But another possibility, which has been just briefly mentioned, and I'll talk about now, and again, I'm really not an expert on this, is materials analysis. And at Duke, we've experimented with this a little bit using portable X-ray fluorescence, PXRF, is an easier way of saying that, which is a non-invasive and non-destructive method using a portable apparatus to reveal the chemical composition of objects, and it can be used on metal. At what we did at Duke was some students who were working with our collection but were UNC students, University of North Carolina students, and who were trained in the appropriate method for using this apparatus in the UNC's Research Laboratories of Archaeology, decided to do a kind of pilot project on the material that we had, and they chose a group of objects that presented particular problems, and that was Corinthian and Corinthianizing pottery. And they did this 2 years ago. And the results were not entirely conclusive, but they showed that there's potential for sorting out at least differences in material that looks similar or that seems to be related in some way stylistically, but the analyses could at least tell us something about where things were produced, if not that they were produced in different places, if not definitively exactly where they were produced. And I think matching this kind of research directly on materials with what we are used to doing with style and with a kind of more connoisseur eye is one way forward. Specifically with this kind of metal material, while working on this paper, and I have to say at the really pretty much the last minute, like 2 days ago, I was looking for a kind of, more information about specific methods for metalwork, and I just came across an article and a dissertation, both I think in 2015 or 2016, maybe even this year for the dissertation, by Stavriani Orfanu at University College London, specifically analyzing, this will blow your minds, specifically analyzing the composition of bronzes from the sanctuaries at Pherai and in other Thessalian sanctuaries, and these are collections that are held at the Museum of Volos in Thessaly and at Athens. Right? And I couldn't absorb this very long 400 and something page dissertation in the time that I had, and I also, don't understand, frankly, I'll say it, I don't understand all of the science. But from what I could absorb, this dissertation analyzes by several methods nearly 300 objects, and fibulae are among these objects. It's mostly jewelry. So here's examples of these different types of fibulae that have traditionally been attributed to different kind of traditions of bronze working, mostly in the north, especially the so-called spectacle fibulae. Let's see if I can get this to work. Right, because it looks like eyeglasses, which are usually associated with the far north, with Macedonia and northern Thessaly. So try to look at these objects from the point of view of their stylistic or formal qualities, and also then to cross-reference this with analysis, direct analysis of the metals themselves, and also to try to look at metalworking techniques, the uses of these objects, and to match these considerations, as I said, with the typological studies, on which the author relies quite a bit. Not only Killian and Killian-Durlmeyer, but earlier scholarly studies by people like Blinkenberg and Butzak. But the emphasis in this dissertation is on production, on its organization, the modes of production, and practices of things that I think most of us who are trained, as I was 30 or more years ago now, really was not on our radar at all, things like the practices of alloying and the working of particular metals, right? So this is a whole different avenue towards, I think, examining this material and advancing our understanding. And it can be also interfaced with craft traditions, what Nasos was advocating, to look at anthropological models for how to approach, production and distribution of material as suggestions for ways to rethink the kind of typological and stylistic matrices that we've relied on for so long. So the author of this dissertation concludes that there are indeed broad workshop traditions, as you can see in the map on the left, or maybe you can't. But anyway, he breaks it down into four or five fairly simple, regional traditions, which go to both with the style of the objects and their formal attributes, but also with what we can see from the metalworking aspects of both their composition and their production. But as I said, since such objects are distributed fairly widely, we still need excavated contexts as archaeologists to get the full picture of how these objects tell their full stories. So what of the Menil bronzes and the ones at Duke and elsewhere? Well, if such analyses were applied, one could possibly affirm a quote-unquote, Thessalian origin or tradition to which they could be attributed, but it wouldn't tell us where they were found necessarily. But as the Menil objects entered the literature, appearing in typological studies, traditional ones, like that of Killian and Killian Durlmeyer, this kind of analysis could really be worthwhile, I think, in kind of showing us some things that we might not see just with our eyes. Okay, so that ends that part. I want to talk then about, for the rest of my time, just a few minutes, kind of more impressionistically about the source of these objects, and that's the gallerist that we've already heard about, Alexander EOLAS, and here are the Menils and he in the gallery here. And this is, again, in token of the kind of expanded horizons I hope we can adopt. As I familiarize myself a little with the other aspects of the collections and the interests and collecting patterns of the Menils, and encouraged also, I have to say, by an email from Nasos who said, this guy's really interesting, I decided to look into him, Alexander EOLAS. And he does seem to me to be a key figure not only in the acquisitions of modern or contemporary art that the Menils made, but he contributed to their engagement with these pre-classical objects as he's already described, as Nasos has already described. And again, I find this intriguing because at Duke we don't have this kind of focus. How the group of Iron Age bronzes came to Houston is part of their biographies. And we've already heard about their interest, the Menil's interest in relating so-called primitive or non-Western objects, similarly abstract across space and time. And it's fascinating that these objects these bronzes all came from EOLAS. And I also found out that he himself was the subject of a recent exhibition in New York, this gallerist, at the Paul Kasman Gallery in 2014. And if anybody's interested, there is a very nice catalog about him and with several essays by people who knew him and worked with him. He was born Konstantin Koutsoudis in Alexandria, so he's an Alexandrian Greek. Early in life, he was a pianist and a ballet dancer. And when he finally wound up in Paris, he was part of circles that included Picasso, Cocteau, Magritte, Ernst, and many others. He was himself drawn initially to the work of de Chirico, and here is a Warhol portrait of him. This is from the Kasman Gallery installation that attempts to try to reconstruct a bit of his kind of sensibility. His love from adolescence was art. He moved on from dance to become a gallerist. He began as the director of the Hugo Gallery in Manhattan and worked especially with the Surrealists. And so his impact on the Menils in part was to encourage them in that direction, to collect the Surrealists who really didn't resonate with them, as I understand it. And he went on to have branches of his galleries in Manhattan, Paris, Milan, and so on. And he was very strongly connected with Warhol. He was, in fact, he gave Warhol both his first and his last exhibit, which is rather interesting. In terms of the formation of the collection, Walter Hopps eloquently describes how the collection brings together under one roof the idiosyncratic, and this is a quote, and disjunctive bodies of material not usually found together in a single exhibition or collection. And we've heard about that, and I'm not going to go on any further about that particular aspect of the collection. But I think there's one thing that he says that I wanted to kind of speak about, and that is the preponderance of the images of beasts. And he suggests, this is Hops, that they may actually, in addition to what we've already heard, be aspects of a shared attitude, an individual style, a special feeling for the refinements of primary form, but also because some of these animals turn up in surrealist art. And so Hops makes that connection, that possibly one reason that these animals are of interest to the Menils is because of their appearance and surrealism. IOLAS, here he is in a photograph. This is in the Macedonian Museum of Contemporary Art. Some of his own collection wound up there. He retired to Greece in the 80s. And this is a picture of him as a dancer in 1937. He was also possibly the inspiration for this De Chirico painting. You might see the resemblance. He also, and I have to say, I came up with my title before I found this. He was the subject of a spread in Vogue in 1982, which was called All That Glitters is Gold. So anyway, his villa in Aia Paraskevi, which is a suburb of Athens, was filled with his own collection, which was quite amazing and just as eclectic as I think the Menil's is. I was thinking of these shots of the interiors at the house last night. Unfortunately, the villa has been vandalized and is a kind of a derelict thing, and the collection was dispersed after his death. He died in New York of AIDS. And this is the last portrait of him that I wanted to mention by Warhol. So I think he is a figure that seems to be neglected as a kind of curator-gallerist, and I just wanted to bring him more to your attention. He seems to have had a really important impact on the Menils and brought them many objects, 300 objects, 350 works of art, including many ancient objects. I want to end just by saying why the birds, okay? And I think that I can't answer this, but maybe anyone who knew the Menils would be able to answer the question. I've noticed that they seem to have a kind of interest in birds. If you look in the gallery, there are many birds represented in there in other aspects of ancient art. There was a show in 1966 called Made of Iron that included bird imagery from all across the centuries in every possible culture. And last night when we were in the house and looking around as kind of voyeurs, I have to say I felt like a voyeur, a privileged voyeur, looking into the little closet bar, there were 3 stuffed birds. So we can speculate about bird imagery and antiquity, but I think bird imagery for the Menils is also an interesting question, and I hope somebody can follow it up. So thank you very much for your attention.
We have time for questions.
Nasus.
Thanks for your focusing on all this. Thanks for focusing on all these wonderful aspects of the collection and for your suggestions for the ways forward. The cue about the IOLAS. In Greece, he has been subject even before his death on a sort of personality assassination, because he was very, very unconventional, eccentric, and towards the end of his mind, he spoke his mind without caring about his image, and what he said did not resonate very well with, let's say, the establishment. He himself was an avid collector of antiquities, as you yourself witnessed, and that how the history of his personal engagement would probably illuminate how he was able to inform the Menils. But I think this is a very, very dark area. You mentioned the beasts, and a factoid here. In 1965, Dominique curated, and I think this was perhaps one of her first as teacher and curator for the art department at the University of St. Thomas. She curated an exhibition, the catalog of which exists. Paul brought it to my attention. An exhibition of mythological animals, demons, and monsters, fantastic creatures, and various anatomical assemblages. I'm just trying to read my very hasty
your notes. I
notes, but I have them here. So this is a very, but this is the period that is the peak of the collaboration with IOLAS. So circumstantial evidence, but relevant.
Yeah. Thank you. And in fact, the catalog of this Made of Iron show, that was what I was looking at yesterday at the last possible minute. And I was actually misled by a source that some of these bronzes were included in that show, and they weren't. But there was a whole group of kind of unattributable and undateable iron objects of animals that were called votives in that show. And it was curated by her. And it included many things from her own collection, but also their own collection, but also many borrowed things from all over Europe and every culture conceivable, from the Sumerians to now. It's a fascinating catalog, actually. But there was this small group, and it was exactly the kind of animals that Sue was talking about, that you were talking about, these small bronzes. And it seemed quite clear how they linked up these different interests. And also in craft, the person who wrote the introduction to the Made of Iron catalog was not Dominique, but actually the curator emeritus of arms and armor at the Metropolitan Museum. And there was armor in this show. And what he said, which I think resonated very well with Dominique's interests, as expressed in other writings, was, we have come to appreciate craftsmanship, not just art, and this kind of everydayness. So anyway, there's this fantastic kind of engagement with objects in every possible way, and I just think that you're right about IOLAS being a kind of mentor. That you pointed me in that direction, and the more I heard about him, he was kind of a tragic figure at the end of his life. He was hounded, he was denounced in the conservative Greek press. It was the period just after the junta in Greece, and he was accused of all kinds of moral turpitude, let's put it that way. He kind of died, I won't say in disgrace, but in exile, even from Greece. So he's a rather tragic figure, but he deserves to be remembered. I think he was quite a fascinating and important figure in his own right.
Two more things. Thanks.
I'm not the moderator.
Thanks for that was a discovery, the dissertation by, you said Stavriani or Fanou. This seems to be important work that may have implications of how we understand something that we can securely talk about. Going back to your questions about the bird, I see a pattern here, bird, horse, and human, that resonates with a book, the title of a book that
Horse,
was very...
Bird, and Man.
By Benson.
Benson, yeah.
I don't know, it would be interesting if we could locate it in the libraries of the Menils to find at least a thread of what was forming their...
Yeah, all sorts of things are going through my head. Epiphany, which, in fact, there's one of the figures in the Menil collection has a bird on the horse, and I thought maybe this made it even more interesting to them. There's, that birds are possibly also kind of evocations of swiftness. They can be divine messengers. There are all kinds of things that birds in antiquity might mean, but what they meant specifically for the Menils, there's a nice Cycladic pyxis in there with a bird on top of it. There's just, when you start looking for them, they're roosters, they're everywhere in this collection. So we have one clue about the horses that you found, right, about the dignity of horses. So there may be something to be found in the archive about the meaning of the birds. I feel like there has to be something that explains this particular assemblage. Thank you.
So I'd like to call up all of the speakers for today and tomorrow. take your seats on the podium, as it were. We'll just remind the audience and the speakers of some of the breadth that we've covered today, and because we've gone far from the history of the Menil to the practices, the attempts at practicing this kind of research, both here and at the Getty. Thank you. To Egypt, and unfortunately, Betsy Bryan, largely because of her new role as Vice Dean that is unforgiving of her time, has already had to leave us. But then we went on to Sue and Nassos, who spoke to us about the horses and Bronze Age, the bronze figurines. And then we've returned in the afternoon with Phoebe, and then Jen, and finally with Carla. I'd like to introduce two people who you have not heard from yet, who are on stage. Morag Kersel, who's raising her hand, and Tori Reed, to her right, who will be directing our workshop tomorrow. Both experts in provenance and the ethics of investigating these objects. So any questions that you have that touch on one person's talk you didn't get to answer or ask your question, or that reach across any of these areas, please. And I should say, anyone on stage is also free to ask questions.
I just started to wonder during Carla's talk about this idea of sort of trying to figure out what was driving the de Menils as collectors, and I think we're all, as you pointed out, we start to become fascinated with that question as we look at the collection. And I guess I wonder what all of you, on reflecting on the different directions that this work has taken you, do you find value in the pursuit of that sort of the why?
I'll just say briefly, because this was something, I said explicitly that kind of ended my paper with. I feel like that does have value in the context for my material in the image of the black, because I don't think it's possible to separate the act of collecting those particular objects from the context of the civil rights movement in Houston at the time, and the role that this institution and that museums as institutions play at moments of social crisis. And it seems like the dispute over the broken obelisk, which was ongoing while these pieces were being purchased, seems to me completely relevant to actually understanding the why. And that doesn't muddy the waters, that doesn't create more of a fog of understanding or kind of pollute a pure scholarly objective. I think it's part of what makes these objects relevant to understanding their role in the collection as it was forming, and it's part of their argument for relevance now and will be going forward. And I think acknowledging that, fronting that even, is not just legitimate, it's required by us as scholars. And it's easier to not do it, but it's important. And I think Phoebe talked about this earlier, and I agree 100%.
Just to add to that, as a curator who works with collectors on an ongoing basis, it's always fascinating to pursue the question of why people are interested in what they're interested in and commit such incredible resources. Now, our collectors are disciplined, right? Tori and I and Christine have trained them not to go after unprovenanced objects. No, but they are actually, and I think that is an important educational role that as curators we can play. But I find that a source of fascination every day, actually. Yeah.
Do you think that we would be here if we didn't have this why question? I mean, because ultimately we're talking about unprovenance material that a collector, whether it's individual or institution, often that's the driving force for the looting of archaeological sites or thefts from museums. So I've just spent the last 3 years talking to low-end collectors who buy Holy Land material. And it's not only the why, it's the everything, really. I mean, because the motivations for looting can be varied, but mostly it's in the end about selling the piece to someone somewhere. So there's a demand that's driving this entire operation. So I think it is the fundamental question that you've just pinpointed there.
And even outside the context of antiquities, no matter what kind of work of art you're looking at, you really can't extricate the work of art itself from the path it's taken to the museum or to the gallery or to the collector's home. And I think understanding the journey it's taken helps us to better understand the art object itself. And things were collected for a particular reason during the Nazi period, things were collected for a particular reason during the 19th century, and things are collected for a particular reason today. We might not always have the historical perspective to understand that, but once we do, I think it helps us understand patterns in taste in collecting much better, regardless of looting or archaeological sites.
But the why of the Menils, I think this is fascinating, and I think today has been just stunningly, the breadth of what they collect and why. I mean, why do they want all these things? Why do they want these birds?
I like them.
I like them too, and I mean, if you walk around the collection, it's also amazing to see what they have collected and what's missing, and collectors they're fascinating. They really are.
Some of them are.
Yeah, I wanted to actually say to you, Carla, at the same time the Menils were collecting, there was a man named Leo Mildenberg collecting.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
So he was obsessed with collecting animals because he could tame them and own them. And so I wondered if it wasn't part of that whole collecting circle, because they all know each other and they're all trading things amongst each other. And so there's this weird obsession with collecting animals because they speak to them or they can tame them.
I don't know anything about, what really, the horses seem to me to be the dignity, that phrase, the dignity of horses, really struck me. And I could be totally wrong about the Menils, but there's this sort of high-mindedness, and I don't mean that as they seem to be real idealists. And the kinds of things that they wrote about what was it you called the everydayness, the common denominator, that kind of common denominator of appreciating everyday objects, some of them, across time, through cultures, their tactility, their charisma, whatever. I mean, I think when, it's like the question about can we get away with, or can we be satisfied with, laser scanned, digitally printed copies or things that join? And the answer is in some ways no. Just in the same way we haven't ever been totally happy with plaster casts. It's just the analog version of that, right? So, there's something that's really evocative, and that's why we're all in this room, let's face it, about the thing itself. And that's what drives collectors, and it drives curators, and it drives the public to come to museums. They want to see things. There's an authenticity that people are after. But I also think that I've been infuriated by the non-philosophy of some collectors who just want, especially people who aren't really educated. I was thinking about your Beverly Hills person was advised to start collecting bronzes. And we all have stories about, exceptional objects that somebody who just made a fortune on Wall Street picked up, and I could think of a famous one sitting on a piano in New York that was, there was a knock on the door and the customs people came and took it. And it went back to Sicily, and there it's just a way to kind of invest and find a place to park your money and maybe establish yourself as a person of a certain class. And the Menils don't fit in that kind of grouping, I think. So I find them personally fascinating in spite of my queasiness about, where these objects came from and what it's cost the archaeological record. But I also, just one last comment, my students ask me, why is this Greek vase in the Vatican, right? And then we have to talk about the trade in objects in the past, the demand for them, the way they cross borders, and the way collections are formed then. It's something that was once in an Etruscan tomb is in the Vatican. And this is a story that goes on and on and on, as I tried to say. It doesn't mean that we should not pay attention to questions of cultural property that were so clearly outlined by Brian, and the cost now in our time of this kind of trade and acquisition. But it's a long-standing story. It goes on and on. Probably always will.
Thank you. I just wanted to make one point. I mentioned last night when I was speaking that we had established a number of workshops for Archaeological Institute of America and Association of Art Museum Directors, AIA and AAMD. And there were some issues that we couldn't agree on, and we would park them and just move past them because we didn't want to spend too much time on an issue that was too emotional for us to discuss, of which there were many, but and there still are to an extent. But one of the issues that we couldn't discuss, we couldn't even begin to discuss it, was the issue of orphaned objects. And that's what we're doing today. You have archaeologists and curators and museum professionals in the same room discussing orphaned objects. And I don't think this has happened before. So I think this is a rather historic occasion. I just wanted to mention that.
If I can say something in regard to that. At lunch today, I was sitting with Morag and Tori and Jen, and precisely that struck me. And I was just saying to Paul that this morning Sue started her talk by saying, I'm going to have to go to someplace that's a little bit dark. And what I have found liberating about today is that almost everyone who has gotten up here has had to talk about something that would normally seem uncomfortable. And perhaps some of you or all of you were uncomfortable in moments up here saying these things. But at the same time, it takes away the sensationalism and the drama to bring it to light and allows more people maybe to talk about these things. So following you, Brian, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for the bravery of speaking about these things so frankly. Other questions?
Hi. So we've kind of touched a little bit about this, but I love this idea of this continuing biography of objects. And so, from an educator's standpoint, how do you go about engaging the next generation then in these questions? How do you go about, especially in your classrooms or through public outreach? What have you found in terms of kind of training up a new generation in order to deal with these issues?
I can give you a practical example from the undergraduate classroom that's hilarious to watch happen. I have an introductory archaeological field methods class that I teach every year at UNC. And when we do an object biographies segment where I'm trying to talk to them about sort of the way to interrogate objects, and they just look at me, and these are archaeology majors, and so they're just thinking, well, you dig it up, and then it has a date, and you're like, no, it's much more complicated than this. So I assign them the task of, when they go home over spring breaks, it's always a spring course, to find an object from their parents' home that their parents will let them take back to their dorm. So it has to be nothing too spectacular or precious. It can't be grandma's jewelry or something. And then they have to write a biography for it. They have to research it. They have to call their aunts. They have to talk to their brothers and ask them if they ever knew about this. And they have to write an object biography for this thing that's been in their house. It has to be something that's been in the house that they grew up with. That's the only kind of parameter I give them. And it's really helpful as a kind of very simple exercise for getting them to think about the embeddedness of objects in their lives, and then also to think about the way that people see objects differently and how habitation with objects is an aspect of life that has been eternal, is always part of human experience. So that's been one way that I've tried to get them to think about objects. That's not nearly as high-minded as I think what you're asking in your question, but it becomes a foundation for a discussion that then moves to a museum. And so we do that, and we talk about it and discuss it, and then we move to museums where the embodied, sort of high object then has to be discussed in a way that mimics what they've just done for something they lived with. And that makes them cognitively kind of step away from it, or at least I hope, in a different way. So that's just a very simple way that in the classroom I've done that.
I was going to ask what's the craziest thing anybody ever brought in? Sorry. I mean, the curiosity is just killing me.
Yeah, okay, so when boy brought his mother's bathrobe, which he had decided was something that had been, like she'd worn it for, it was his mom's robe that she had worn since he was a kid. It was very odd, I have to say. He sort of showed up with this pink, yeah, it was a sort of fetish object. It was weird. That was awkward. And everyone in the class sort of sat back and just listened. But normally it's pictures or it's a memento that wasn't, a valuable memento. It's always a grandparent associated thing, almost always. It's really interesting that that's how it's usually a memento associated with a lost.
An heirloom.
It's an heirloom, but it's often personalized, and so they do that on their own, and I don't know why. And but yeah, the bathrobe.
So I
was really
do the
weird.
same kind of thing, but I make them look for old world objects in Chicago. Did you know that there is a column from a Greek temple from Italy on Lake Shore in Chicago?
No.
That Mussolini.
Oh.
That was the object biography of an old world object in Chicago. So instead of bringing it to the personal, their own family, to their city, and thinking about how these objects from somewhere in the Middle East or from somewhere else get to Chicago, there's also a piece of the Berlin Wall at one of the L stops. So, I mean, it actually personalizes the city and helps them think about how is it that there's something from Mussolini and why would that happen? And then they write it up in a Wikipedia assignment. Yeah.
On a small scale, for our project, Judith and I have come across some really interesting case studies, a few of which appeared today. And we've tried to, when we can, put those on social media or have Facebook Live or Periscopes. And it's incredible the numbers of people that watch these. And so it's kind of this thing where the social media team at the Getty contacted us and we said, oh yeah, we have great stories to share. And so it's kind of just connecting the dots in that way. And so that's been a good way to start. And it also is a way to say, this stuff is coming online, check out our collection pages. But we're hoping, moving forward, to continue the dialogue with education too.
I have a question somewhat following that one about the context of display. And I apologize if maybe some of you talked about this, but since it's a group of archaeologists and curators and provenance scholars, I'd like to ask what is the ideal context of display, and how we display antiquities and non-Western objects here is very different than how the Museum of Fine Arts, for example, or the Museum of Natural Science even. So if you could maybe point out to some museums that do it very well or very articulately for education, but also for the general public.
So that's a great question. I think, well, let me say that obviously every institution is different, and that's what I tried to highlight a little bit in my talk, is just how, and I think they're different, I mean, not only because of the mission, but also the audience. So for instance, I was at an event at Harvard, Amy and I were both there, a few weeks ago, in which our directors, along with, were interviewed by another museum director. And it became clear to me how different our audiences are, because at Harvard, students play such a strong role. And at the MFA, we have the general public of whom students are an important part. And so I think the most important question is, who is your audience? And that is what should drive one's display. And brilliant designers, which we have. Sorry.
If I may add to this, objects are like words. They have an infinite potential, almost algorithmically, to be combined into endless expressions. There is no meaning in a certain sense. Meaning is created in the intersection between viewers and objects. So very often, or until very recently, and contrary to what Phoebe said, specialists present in museums what they know, and they know the classifications and typologies and groupings that are the artificial devices that are the stock and trade of publication. This is very, very boring, and oftentimes it results in arrangements that are so arbitrary and unself-consciously arbitrary. So I applaud what Phoebe says, and I feel that those who have at their hands didactic collections that they can make available to students to create their own exhibitions, temporary didactic devices are really, really blessed. And in this respect, I think you are doing a great service to your students by bringing them in and having them think dynamically with this wealth of objects and information.
I think museums are able and are beginning to bring more discussion of provenance into their gallery labels and into their didactic text, and is something that we've started to do at the MFA, not only object by object, where we have provenance labels that accompany certain works of art in the galleries, highlighting some aspect of that object's past, but also broader, like much longer texts about how did these objects get here. I know there's an excellent one, for example, in the Egyptian galleries. And I think as moving forward, I would be interested in even problematizing some of these even more as we work with, for example, our African collections, or things that maybe came out of their countries of origins during periods of colonialism, where we have the objects, and there's just a very, very complex history there that needs to be unpacked. And I think that we have the room and the ability to do that now.
I think there's no better question that would be a nice segue into the gallery itself to look at these objects.
I saw a hand raised back there.
There is one last question.
Sorry, I'm hiding back here. So kind of in light of the last talk, and also referring to kind of some of the nods we've had towards the collaboration between all of you, I have a question, I guess, kind of about the collaborative value of a project like this. How often did you all communicate while you were doing this project, and were there any specific communications that shed specific light on your own projects, or perhaps that you were surprised by in finding overlap between your presentations?
I can say that I think there are 3 people in this country that work on early Iron Age Greek metal objects. And to discover that we were all invited to be in this thing, I was stunned, and I thought, well, wait a minute. Don't we need more breadth? That was before I realized what a specialty this was in this collection. And then I thought, I am so excited to get together, the 3 of us, here and what we're going to be talking about and learning from each other. And I think it's just been wonderful. We only really did communicate maybe one round of email. Maybe you and Nasos did more, but...
And I also talked to Jen,
yeah.
because she's right in my backyard, and we could get together and talk about it. But I do want to say that although my earliest expertise is in the Iron Age, I think part of why I was invited is what John alluded to, is our conversation at the AIA meeting, and it's my involvement with the NASHER collection as something that I was sort of presented with and, asked, is this legit? Can we actually accept this? And, we did. And then my collaboration with Sheila Dillon, and also I'm happy to say with Marianne Wardle, who's here somewhere. I don't know where she is. Is she still there? There you are. Who is a curator at the NASHER and is here today. And she works specifically with faculty who want to use the collections and encouraging faculty and also the public. But, and so part of what we had to do when the new NASHER Museum came online is deal with the fact that the whole collections policy of Duke was changing. It was going to be on contemporary art. We were not collecting antiquities anymore. We're not accepting antiquities that don't have provenance. We've turned stuff down. I'm not sure how many things, but I know of some. And so part of it was how to creatively continue to engage with what was going to be this body of material, which is, several hundred objects at this point? How many total? About 500. And that includes acquisitions that were made many years ago, starting in the 60s, gifts and acquisitions in the 60s, which we're not adding to, and then this collection, which really filled in a lot of gaps just by chance, and has material that's both everyday and quite nice, like the cycladic material. And it was part of my teaching mission. This is not my research. It was a very wide, group of material. And so, to kind of get to the question of how to engage students and how to engage the public, what the students have been doing in the 3 seminars I've taught out of this now is come up with their own shows. Maybe we've helped them with a theme or told them, no, that's not going to work, or we can't have so many small objects, or, whatever. But we've given them space, said, this is how much space you have, this is when it has to be ready. And they work in groups and they work individually. They write longer papers, but they also research and do catalog entries. And one of the things is they're limited in what they know. Right? They're undergraduates, many of them. Even the art history students don't necessarily know a lot about antiquity. But also the context is this collection, which is very broad and has a very wide range of material, including material from the Americas, from Africa, there's stuff from the Bremer collection, right? The Bremers were spoken of today. Medieval. I mean, it's quite a wide collection, and so the students are making up their own connections out of this material, and we're constantly trying to have them recontextualize it and keep it fresh. So that's another way, that we're all, I think, doing. Instead of, in the old days, in the old Duke University Museum, which I saw before it closed, it was all of the antiquities, and they were set out in those typological, right? All of the cups, right? All the Etruscan material here, and we can't do that anymore. So we had to come up with another approach, and I think it's a more fruitful approach, frankly, than the old one.
I just wanted to add a comment. I've been with the Menil almost 24 years now, and we've had events at the de Menil House many times, and I can't remember who told us. I want to say it was Paul Winkler, one of our directors at the time, but we were going through her bedroom because the house is usually open to guests when we have events there. And there was a Magritte painting, and it was a phoenix. And it's a very small work, but he was telling us that it was one of her or John's favorite work, phoenix. One of their favorite works in the collection. So I don't know whether she ever wrote anything in the files on that, but many times she, because I've looked at files working with artists that have done talks with us in the past too.
Thank you for that.
I thought that was interesting, yeah.
Thank you. That might be the key.
The key to the birds. Any other questions? I'm sure there are many, many more. Please join the speakers in the gallery and enjoy the objects. Thank you all for coming, and anyone who's coming tomorrow, we look forward to seeing you there. Anyone else, please feel free to be in touch.